and welcome to the Debrief. This is Carolina Journal's weekly wrap-up of all the news stories that we've been covering in state government, public policy here in North Carolina. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal, and joining us this week, we have Teresa Opeka, who is a political reporter for Carolina Journal, and David Bass, who covers everything education for us. So make sure you check out our website at carolinajournal.com and catch all of their stories. Also, we have opinion editor David Larson and his Daily Outrage. He's going to tell us what that's going to be this week. And Kelly Lester joining us from the John Locke Foundation. We're going to be talking about ESG investing, so stick around for that. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Debrief. We're going to be bringing it to you every single week. I'm looking forward to really what we've got going this week, so let's jump right in. We have some brand new poll numbers out today, and it really is an interesting look at what the 2024 gubernatorial race could mean. So a poll out this week shows that Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson leads both of his Republican challengers in a matchup against the likely Democratic nominee and current Attorney General Josh Stein. He comes out ahead of Stein in the poll of likely North Carolina voters. However, a significant number of those polls said they are undecided in that GOP primary. It leaves a little room for Mark Walker and Dale Folwell to potentially grow in their percentage. So we're going to be watching that really closely. David, you had a great story out on carolinajournal.com about this poll. What struck you about some of the numbers we were seeing?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you see, obviously, in the poll results, kind of Robinson's broad appeal across the Republican electorate. His name recognition obviously is very high. People know who he is, what he stands for, that sort of thing. And then you look at like Mark Walker and Dale Folwell, their name recognition isn't quite as good. I think particularly with Folwell, outside kind of the Raleigh area, outside some of those bubbles, he's not as well known. So I think that's going to be a huge hurdle for him in the primary to kind of get his name more out there. Sure. But I also think it just speaks to how much popular support kind of Robinson has. And I mean, people I talk with just generally, they more than likely know who he is, either on the pro side or the negative side. Like, he elicits a lot of strong opinions, so he's just well known. And I think that's seen in this poll.
We talked a little bit about voter ID in this poll. What were those numbers on that?
Yeah, it was, again, as pretty much all polls have showed, there was a strong majority of people who favored voter ID. But one of the, I think all the recent polling has shown that. One of the interesting things, though, on this one, it's up there on the screen, was that the question was asked of, do you currently have a legal ID of some sort? And it was over 96% of people said that they did, which I think is interesting, because the argument a lot of times against voter ID is, well, what about people who don't have it, or it's, that sort of thing, but obviously most people do, and the laws anyway would provide an ID for those who don't already have one. Right.
And in this poll, if you want to go to carolinajournal.com, you can see it there. One of the things in this poll was an overwhelming support for school choice. And that's something the governor really was pushing back on this week. He's term limited, lame duck, is not sitting too well with him. What was that about?
Yeah. The poll results showed, so they actually polled the specific bill that had just passed the House, which was expanding the Opportunity Scholarship to all income levels. And there was majority support for that. I think on the broader questions of, should parents be the ones deciding on their kids' education, or should school boards decide, that sort of thing, again, overwhelmingly people said parents should be making the decision. So these results, though, dropped just a few days after Roy Cooper has declared this statewide emergency for K-12 public education funding. So I think it's interesting you see this juxtaposition of great support for school choice with this kind of hair on fire aspect that's going on with Roy
absolutely.
Cooper.
We actually have some of the video of Governor Cooper declaring a state of emergency. If you're not aware of it, he put a big red bar across the top of his website and said there is a state of emergency, and then when he finally got to talk about it, he said, well, not like a hurricane or anything. So it was interesting, some of the comments that he had right there from the executive mansion. Here's what he had to say.
It's clear that the Republican legislature is aiming to choke the life out of public education. I'm declaring this state of emergency because you need to know what's happening. If you care about public schools in North Carolina, it's time to take immediate action and tell them to stop the damage that will set back our schools for a generation. Here's what's happening in the next few weeks. Their private school voucher scheme will pour your tax money into private schools that are unaccountable to the public and can decide which students they want to keep out. They want to expand private school vouchers so that anyone, even a millionaire, can get taxpayer money for their children's private academy tuition. When kids leave public schools for private schools, the public schools lose hundreds of millions of dollars. And while they hand out private school vouchers to millionaires, they also want to give them large tax breaks too. This drops an atomic bomb on public education by shrinking the state's budget by almost 20%. Public school superintendents are telling me they'll likely have to cut schools to the bone, eliminate early college, AP, and gifted courses, art, music, sports, if the legislature keeps draining funds to pay for private schools and those massive tax breaks. It's clear.
All right, an atomic bomb, a state of emergency. I mean, these are some pretty strong words in a community that's just coming out of a pandemic and entering hurricane season. You had a chance to talk to some of those other executive council of state members. You know, what do they have to say about this? Because this would be up to them if it was a real state of emergency.
Right, right. There's a few that declined to answer, but a few, definitely said, they didn't have the greatest of words for Governor Cooper's actions, and obviously saying it is a fake emergency. It's not a real emergency, like Lieutenant Governor Robinson, he, in an emailed statement, had that to say through a spokesperson. I also talked to State Treasurer Dale Falwell yesterday, and he didn't mince words either. So yeah, they didn't have the same reaction. The Governor Cooper, it's like, oh, like you say, hair on fire, as you mentioned before, or a true state of emergency, like maybe a hurricane barreling through.
Sure.
Yeah. So it wasn't. It was mixed, but it wasn't really pulled toward how everybody else is feeling about this. It's not a true emergency.
Sure, sure. So, David, do you think this is more of a political stunt than an actual policy comment?
Absolutely, yeah. I think he's kind of reaching in his toolbox a little bit. He doesn't have the veto anymore, and he's saying, okay, what can a governor do? I mean, they can declare states of emergency. But, I mean, obviously it's not a real state of emergency, but he's still using that language. It's kind of confusing, I guess, to a lot of people. Like, is he actually going to use some executive powers? Because that is something a governor does with states of emergency. It doesn't look like that. It looked like more of a political statement. I know the FCC actually has a, regulations on the misuse of the emergency alert system. And I was like, I wonder, he was clear, I guess, that he wasn't going to use any certain powers, but it's just kind of a confusing thing, and a lot of the language is very extreme on choking to death the public school system, dropping an atomic bomb on it, when it was something, as the polling showed, is actually fairly popular.
It's interesting, if you went to his website, Cooper's website, he had up a banner that made it look like a hurricane was about to hit the state or something like that, which to me also, it starts to make like, well, if this is an emergency, then doesn't it kind of, a real emergency, doesn't it kind of downplay the importance of that?
It's like you're breaking news. We're all immune to breaking news anymore.
Right, and tell that to the people who are still sitting in hotels, from 6 years ago, Matthew. But he got a lot of national attention from this too. Senator Tom Tillis commented on it on Twitter. He called it basically a temper tantrum and said, this is indicates that he is having trouble letting go of the power that he's had over the last few years. So this was probably an emailed statement. I'm thinking that didn't fit on Twitter. But it really is interesting to see that the forces are kind of circling around these core issues, things like school choice, and it's becoming kind of a hollow, an echo chamber that he's sitting in. Kelly, tell me what your thoughts were when he did this, because dealing with agriculture and the hurricanes are a big deal. National state of emergency is a big deal.
Yeah, no, I found it quite amusing. I understand the optics of it at this point. School choice across America is becoming popularized, and people who are pro-public school or politicians who receive funding from people who are pro-public school feel very threatened right now. And so it is interesting to see these tactics being used at this point.
Very interesting.
And especially being in North Carolina, where hurricanes are actually something that does happen.
Right, that's an
I don't know if I would be using that as a comparison.
Yeah, before we wrap up this topic, our tweet of the week actually came from this story. David, you want to introduce that? It was your story. You got a big shout out on Twitter.
We just got out a story shortly after Cooper made the announcement, and Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor and current presidential candidate running in the GOP race, she had put out a tweet to the article, which was nice, and a few others saw it as well. So
Ben Shapiro
a few others
retweeted that.
Yeah, Ben Shapiro retweeted
got
it.
national attention. So that,
so I think it almost defeated the purpose. Like he got a lot more negative attention than positive. Yeah, very interesting. All right, we're gonna switch gears a little bit, Kelly. I'm gonna come right back to you. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about ESG investing, and I'm not sure I totally understand exactly what it means, but you're calling it woke investing. Fill us in a little bit.
Yeah, it is kind of woke investing. It is, you could argue, the left pushing its agenda into something that has usually been based off of key economic performance indicators, which is finance and investing.
Right.
So now this idea is that investors are choosing to build portfolios around companies that show environmental, social, or governance standards.
Okay.
And the thing is that this is not standardized in any way. There's about 140 rating agencies in America alone that rate your ESG levels as a public company.
What does that stand for? Tell me what that means.
Environmental, social, and governance.
Okay, so what are they looking for when they give you that rating?
They're looking for, it can be a variety of things. The biggest one right now is obviously the environmental aspect. What are you doing to, are you partnering with, other companies in your supply chain that use renewable resources or sustainable practices? And so in agriculture, this is a really big issue right now because the majority of the agricultural supply chain is actually publicly traded. So whereas most small farms aren't going to be, which is 98% of farms in America, the companies that they deal with are publicly traded. Well, the SEC last year started talking about having it be where public companies had to disclose even the environmental impact of everyone within their supply chain, which would include the small farmers. So even though they're not a publicly traded company, they now can't do business with a publicly traded company because either A, they don't meet these environmental standards because they simply can't afford it.
So it'd be devastating.
It would be extremely devastating.
Sure, and this is growing. You shared us some information that's really getting big. Look at this. This is a tremendous amount of ESG investing just in what, 2 years? 1 in 3
investors now are investing in some type of ESG strategy.
Wow.
It is, there are investing fads that happen over time, and they usually fade away. We are seeing this become so integral even in small businesses' access to capital, things like that. It is being very much ingrained in all of finance, and it's going to affect even small businesses, both in urban and rural areas.
Very interesting. What does this mean about pensions? So with something we've talked about internally, are pension plans, are they investing in this?
They are in some states, but I think this is something that Republicans are taking notice of because, as she said, it seems like a backdoor way of imposing, regulations that nobody's voted for, but kind of progressive investors have. So that's one way that some of these Republicans that have taken notice of this are trying to fight back is the pension funds that a Republican treasurer like Falwell might be in charge of. They can just say, we're not going to invest in these ESG funds, and then that will delegitimize them to some degree, take some of their power away. But so Falwell and West Virginia and actually Florida last night in Governor of Florida Ron DeSantis' announcement, one of the things he focused on is showing what kind of a big issue this has become in the Republicans is ESG in his state, that they passed a bill and he's signing it to divest from it and look at kind of taking power away from it in other ways. So it's definitely a big issue.
Yeah, of course. David Bass, do you think this is part of a cultural trend we're seeing pushing back on some of these woke politics? You're seeing it in education. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's been, especially in the last few years, obviously this huge push to kind of, force people to agree with a certain viewpoint from a, even a corporate standpoint and all this, the general kind of woke stuff. So I think this is another example where in a lot of cases in the last couple of years, there are a lot of states that are pushing back against that. Red states are saying this is not happening here. We're not going to put up with it.
Yeah, of course. Could this impact, Teresa, you cover Dale Falwell and our state government a lot, could this impact some of what we see in retirement plans and how the Treasury operates?
I think it could, but as David Larson mentioned before, Treasurer Falwell's strictly against this. He talked about BlackRock. He's very vehemently opposed to all of this. So it would take a wait-and-see approach for that, especially if he's not going to be in the office if he does lose the nomination for Republican governor. And we also have Representative Bradford from Mecklenburg County who's vying for that spot right now of treasurer. and who else, maybe other candidates will come by. So might be a question to ask if there is a new person in that office in the future.
Very interesting. Something we have to be really watching very closely. All right. So switching, actually, we're talking about that corporate and government interwoven, coming right back to you, VinFast. So these were some horrible reviews of this car that we saw come out this week. That plus eminent domain and all the drama around incentives. What's the latest on VinFast?
Sure. We'll start with the reviews since that was the latest news.
Sure. Of course, this is an electric vehicle company. If you don't know, it's an electric vehicle company that had a grant to come into Chatham County, I believe.
Yes. They want to build a $4 billion plant in Moncure in Chatham County.
Sure.
And the state is supposed to look to give them a JDIG grant.
Sure.
Right. So we'll get into that in a minute. But bad reviews came out in the last couple of weeks. Just don't drive it. Abysmal. They're borrowing a line from Elvis Presley, Return to Sender. I mean, it was that bad of a review. I mean, you had Motor Trend, which has been around since the 1940s, a very respectable magazine. The guy said, I would be embarrassed if I was a car dealer to actually hand the keys over to someone who's going to try to test drive this.
It's bad news.
It's just not ready for prime time. There's various issues with the HVAC system. It would turn to 80 the moment you get in the car, would not reset. They couldn't set the controls on it.
Oh my gosh.
Guy rolled almost backward into someone in traffic when you start driving. Multiple issues. Another review said they actually got car sick. They haven't got car sick in years because the way it weave and bob. So it's just so many terrible. But one good thing, it comes in really beautiful colors.
Oh, good.
Good. Very good reviews of the colors.
But there's been some struggling with this plant anyway. They were having trouble. They pushed it out a year. What's the latest? Do you think we're going to get it?
That's a question for our crystal ball, right?
Right.
It doesn't look good because I think they were initially going to think about actually starting this year, the end of this year, I think, and then it pushed all the way back to 2025 for the plant. And as you mentioned, they had actually in the last few years they've lost about $3 billion altogether. And so the company president, one of the richest, if not the richest person in Vietnam, put some of his own money in. They actually set up an agreement with a acquisition company to get on the New York Stock Exchange to help them pump more money into it. They're still looking for $50 million to build the training center in nearby Sanford. That was discussed too. There's so many things stacked against this company, unfortunately, and they had the JDIG grant. But the sad thing is, and the human interest part of this is eminent domain.
Right.
I mean, there's, how many houses, up to maybe 30 houses are going to get bulldozed, get you out of the way. Mary Oaks Baptist Church has been around for over 100 years. Those people have to find a new place to worship. There's so many so many questions and variables about this story at this point.
Yeah, this actually brings a good point. Eminent domain. There was a really important court case that meant you could take homes, churches, whatever, for a private project.
Yes, absolutely. So that was a controversy in Connecticut in the town of New London. They call it the Kelo case, and it was a very important Supreme Court case because traditionally, eminent domain was used if the government wants to build a road or build a school or a park. They would say, okay, sorry, you guys, your house is where we want to be, so here's some, market value for that. But in that Kelo case in New London, Connecticut, the government wanted to take people's land and say, we have a better private use of that land and give it to a business that was going to build a big factory. So since that case, it's been something it's kind of allowed governments to pick winners and losers. And in this case, VinFast is not a public park or a road, it's a company. And the government is saying to all these houses and businesses and a church, and we think your land would be better in this electric car company's hands. So that's a 2005 case, and the impacts of that are still happening in cases like this where, the government can kind of pick winners and losers.
Sure. And picking winners and losers is kind of what incentives are, right? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, just what immediately came to mind to me is interesting because you have a situation here where a lot of times Democrats are against, cutting a corporate income tax rate or having it be relatively low, but then they're in favor of picking kind of winners and losers with these different corporations in a very targeted way. So instead of creating a level, floor with taxation, they just want to, pick and choose where things go. So. I think that's a good example of just basic unfairness and what's going on.
And getting back to what David Larson mentioned about that Kelo case and other cases up in Detroit, a lot of these companies in Detroit, they actually built, I think it was for Ford or GM. They built the plant, but eventually it all shut down. All these houses were destroyed. Up in Connecticut, I think that was built, it was Pfizer, I believe it was.
Right.
That was also shut down afterward. So it's just roll of the dice.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to watch for sure. We watch in this case very closely. Like and follow for the debrief so we can bring you more of this coming to you every week. One of the stories that really caught my attention, of course, David Larson's going to be writing about this, medical marijuana. We're seeing this in the North Carolina General Assembly, maybe popping up again soon. What are you finding out about this?
Yeah, so this, sometimes I write an outrageous story. I wouldn't say, I'm outraged or anything like that. I just think this is something that needs to be considered because we're a state that really hasn't opened ourselves up to, a lot of other states have, to medical marijuana.
Right.
And so Senate Bill 3 passed the Senate, I believe a couple months ago, 36-10, so bipartisan. And, now it's, next week it looks like it's going to be in the House Health Committee.
Okay.
And the signals are that it'll probably move through there and pass.
Right.
So that's kind of the rumors is that, this medicinal marijuana bill will get passed, and it's more restricted than a lot of other states that are, just you go in, you say you had a headache or it helps you sleep. A lot of, everybody's probably known somebody who's lived in California and said, oh yeah, doctor just.
I have anxiety.
Yeah, I have anxiety or,
Right.
So I just think it's been interesting to see more and more research come through. So this month, the National Institute of Health released something on schizophrenia that for males between 21 and 30, that they found 30% of, that's just that was, I put that up there because growing up, people would watch that movie and laugh at it because that's so over the top and ridiculous, it's pretty innocent. Well, back in that day, marijuana was 1% THC, so that was very hyperbolic. Now, a lot of times it's 30% THC.
30%?
30% in Colorado, California. That's at the upper limit. A lot of times it's more 15 to 20% THC, but still, that would be the equivalent of taking 15 hits of a 1960s or 70s joint each hit. So the potency is kind of like with opioids, you see something like fentanyl, or with meth, there's this like super meth out right now that's causing problems.
Yeah.
So, potency of drugs changes over time. And I guess some of the research coming out is that this very potent marijuana, with our mental health rise in mental health problems that we're seeing, it just may be something to keep an eye on. I'm not necessarily saying, this is something we shouldn't consider, but some of these, like PTSD is one of the conditions in Senate Bill 3. And I don't, some of the people who were speaking when the Senate was voting on this said there isn't really good advice, or evidence that it helps PTSD, and even some of the medical organizations or psychological ones are saying it's actually pretty bad for mental health in general, like what's being seen with schizophrenia. So just something to keep an eye on. As that moves.
Sure. We talked about this before we came on here. Yeah. That you were like, nope, this is about, maybe it's about an age, it's individual. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So my always common understanding as far as the schizophrenia correlation with marijuana use had a lot to do with brain development and early adolescent use of consistent marijuana use, and that's been. And I haven't read obviously this more recent study, which might use different methods, different data. That wasn't available before when those initial kind of results came out. But it's always been under this idea that if you're an adult and you partake in this substance occasionally, you're fine. The odds of anything bad happening, and maybe with these stronger, I've been in California, I've seen 65%.
65% THC.
THC infused, they dip them in wax, and they do all sorts of fun stuff. And so maybe at that level, you are going to start seeing some issues, especially if you're dealing with mental health issues already. And now you're messing with the chemicals in your brain. Something might happen.
But is this a normalization? I mean, once you start this process, and I think that's what a lot of the objection has been to medical marijuana, is that you're introducing it and normalizing it as part of the community and part of the society.
Well, it's a slippery slope kind of thing. It's once medical marijuana is usually the first step towards decrim, and then decrim is the next step is legalization, So I think that's usually people's fear and pushback on it.
Yeah, I think it does, like for younger people, especially if that's the group that's the most at risk for brain development. But another thing I found interesting looking into this is UC San Diego just published statistics that they've had a spike of 1,808% increase in people 65 and over going to the ER based on
Older
marijuana.
people?
Old people,
Oh, gosh.
because they see what it treats, and they're like nausea, pain, things like that, and so
Right.
they'll get it, and they'll remember having smoked it in the 1960s or 70s.
Right, when it was 1%.
Yeah, when it was 1%, and so they've seen this massive spike in them just having a psychotic episode or a massive panic attack, and they're 75 years old, and they're all of a sudden just So it is something that if it is culturally more open, and people might not realize this, it can be pretty strong
it's
and
different.
and have psychological effects that people should at least be informed on the side
Very
effects of that.
interesting. Yeah, David, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's interesting to just talk with folks who have come from states where it's maybe been around for a while, legalized,
Right.
like Colorado or different ways. I feel like that kind of gives a new perspective on it because it's very new for us here, but actually understanding what, not just the kind of what's going on medically, but even maybe some of the cultural changes and how everything, is impacted by that is very good to hear.
I remember talking to Senator Bergen last year.
Yes.
He was out for a trip out to Colorado, and he actually saw firsthand people in the park. They were strung out, maybe not medical marijuana, but marijuana in general. And he really had hesitancy about going any further with anything to do with that here.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, it is important, and you think it'll be in the General Assembly possibly next week?
I think what I saw from reporters online is that it leaked to them that it would be it was moved from Rules Committee to House Health, and that it would be heard in House Health this coming week.
Sure.
And probably, once they decide to move a bill off, and it goes into that committee's
And what we're talking about, just to make sure, this is about medicinal marijuana, and it sets up a system by which there would be 12, maybe a dozen licenses and a distribution process. This is something Senator Rabin feels very strongly about. A cancer survivor has been really pushing this for a while and feels like this is a tightly controlled way of doing this. And that was your experience when you covered it.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Like there's differences. Like people, are for the medical because it obviously helps some certain conditions, but what is it a gateway to marijuana? Okay, we approve this. Are you going to go ahead and approve, regular marijuana? See what's happening in Colorado. San Francisco is a really good explanation about all the drug use right now, marijuana and other things where a lot of these companies are closing up and moving out, all these, high-end companies. So, it's... Yeah,
sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's very interesting. We're going to be following that story. We'll probably be talking about it. If it does show up, it'll definitely show up right here, too, on the Debrief on next Thursday. So make sure you subscribe, follow us, and we'll bring it right to you. Thanks for watching.